Okay, thank you. So I welcome you all, and I'm very excited and honored to be holding this talk to you today. And I want to talk about my PhD thesis called Immersive Medical VR Training Simulators with Haptic Feedback. So today's medicine faces a couple of new challenges due to increased life expectancy and a demographic shift towards a more elderly society. Those two factors cause an increased prevalence of mobility-related diseases. So we can see this in statistics. For example, here in Germany, the most common type of surgery are musculoskeletal surgeries. And the two most common ones of these are the hip surgery and the knee surgery. And you can see that over the years, there's a steady increase in those. And for hip surgery, actually the success rate of the surgery depends heavily on the surgeon's experience. So this is directly correlated. And thus, of course, it is really important to start early and frequent practice. And by practice, I mean the actual practice, so gaining experience at doing the actual thing. Otherwise, teaching is really difficult, and I will show you here some examples why it is difficult. And there will be some blood here shown, so if you're uncomfortable with that, please look away for the next 10 seconds or so. So during hip surgery, the surgeon has to navigate mostly by feeling. So you can see that the instrument is almost completely occluding the hip bone. So as a limited sight, and so he has to concentrate only on his feeling, but he also has to exert large forces. So here you can see that the surgeon really pushes his body weight onto the instrument. And this is a really bad combination, and it makes students really timid to exert these large forces without any vision. Another interesting area is dental surgeries. Here we have other challenges, and these are mostly of the psychomotor and cognitive kind. For example, as you can see here, you have to precisely control two tools at the same time. And what is even more difficult is that one of the tools needs to be hand-eye coordinated with a mirrored image. So the drill here can only be seen, the tooth can only be seen in the mirror, and so the hand-eye coordination has to correct for that, which is really difficult if you have never practiced this. So the traditional training looks as follows. It starts by gaining theoretical knowledge, and then moves on to learning with physical dummies. So, for example, made of plastic, but those have the downside that they are not realistic, especially for hip surgery. They do not feel like the real bone, and still they are costly. And a better alternative are donor organs. So these are realistic, and they're also safe. However, these are really rare, right? So the problem here is a lot of students never get the opportunity to use any donor organs. Another downside, you could also say, is that they're all unique. They all have a life behind them. So if there's a difficult case, then you cannot repeat it. And so what is done today in practice is often that students pretty early go on to assist during live procedures and gain more and more responsibilities in those. And here I see a good opportunity for VR simulators to complement this training process. And the benefits of those are that they are completely repeatable, and of course they're also safe. And the repeatability means you can lower operational costs, and you could possibly also improve the training quality, since if you're bad at some specific case, then you can just repeat it as often as you want. Also, the feedback is automated. This is good for both sides. So the instructor doesn't have to look at so many half-drilled teeth, and the student gets objective feedback. If you ask an instructor for the 20th time in the same day, how is this tooth, then they likely will not give you objective feedback. And if you include haptic feedback, like you see here, then you can even train the haptic sensations and feelings. And if you have hand-tool alignment, meaning where you feel the device and where you see the tool matches, then you can even train hand-eye coordination with these simulators. Now, the current state of the art of VR simulators focuses mostly on VR-only simulators. So, for example, by Logischetti and Raman, you can see that they use these VR controllers, and they are mostly input devices. They cannot output any force, so they don't have any force feedback. Still, they report that participants increased with their simulator in performance, but the performance was only measured inside of the simulator. That means that you can never be sure, do they learn the simulator or do they improve at the real task? And even simulators that have haptic feedback, for example, here, this is a simulator for hip arthroplasty and this for total hip arthroplasty, both use low force haptic feedback. So these phantoms, they can generate around 3 newtons, but for hip surgery, you want more like 100 to 200 newtons. So this is even for commercial surgery simulators. So the research gaps that I have identified are firstly that high force haptic feedback doesn't really exist, and there are certainly no VR simulators that support this. Secondly, the haptic material removal mostly uses VoxMap point shell, which discretizes the material, and so there is no method that has stepless material removal at haptic rates. And the efficacy of HMD-based VR haptic simulators is mostly measured in terms of in-simulator performance improvement. So for the first two, to tackle them, I have developed my own simulation system, which I will show you next. And then later on, I will show you a few simulators that I have developed. And on those, we can see how effective they are. So this is my simulation system, and it differs in a few key aspects to traditional simulations. And I will go through each of them. And we will start with the physics part, because that's the most important and the most complex. And before I start, I quickly want to mention that I do not use a triangle mesh, like you see here. Instead, I use a volumetric model based on sphere packings. And for the tool, I also have a bounding volume hierarchy to further accelerate geometric queries. And for the environment, this is what I call the left object here. This can be drilled, and I assume that it is static in the world. So the first difference is continuous collision detection. This is a feature I added to circumvent several issues that might occur otherwise. For example, a simulation might experience pop-through. So, okay, you cannot really see this so well here. So during integration, it might happen that small features are simply ignored if the integration step is too large. And another issue is that if you have large integration steps, it might happen that you have deep penetration, and those can lead to incorrect contact normals. So this normal is pointing inside, or it's basically reporting that the outside is below, whereas the old state is at the top, so you would expect the normals to point upwards. And both of these issues can be fixed by continuous collision detection. So, for example, we have this tool state, and the integration might result in this pose. Of course, this is exaggerated, but just as an example. And
switch off the light if you want more contrast.
Yeah, maybe. I hope you can see. I don't have so many of these pictures. So continuous collision detection would result in the following pose. So it gives a pose that is close to the one that we wanted, but it is intersection free. And yeah, we have here the earliest point of contact. And here to calculate this, I separate rotation and translation. And that means that I can simplify the motion to this motion ray. So then the continuous collision detection wants to, or the goal is to compute the earliest point of contact of a swept sphere against a static sphere. And the cool thing about spheres is that we can simplify this to the Minkowski sum of these two spheres. And then the query becomes a ray against a sphere intersection, which is a really cheap geometric query. And these observations and other allow me to implement this very efficiently on the GPU. And I basically test the environment spheres, each in parallel, against one bounding volume hierarchy. And this allows me to compute the continuous collision detection in 0.15 milliseconds for a realistic sphere packing of 100,000 against 2,000 spheres. So, as a rule of thumb, for haptic rendering, you want around 1 millisecond or less, so we are well below that. The next extension is, or the next step is contact detection. And you might say that contact, we already had a contact here, right? But that was only singular contact, but it is better if we have multiple contacts. And normal simulations just allow overlap, and then you automatically get multiple contacts. But I do not allow overlap. Instead, I expand one of the objects. So as you can see here, I expand the radius of all the spheres, and that gives me an offset surface. In practice, I use around 2 millimeters for this offset, so it's really small. But it produces multiple contacts. And the cool thing now is all contacts have normals that point outside, and they're guaranteed to behave well. And again, I optimize the implementation and get the result in around 0.21 milliseconds for this step. And yeah, you might ask, why does this take longer than the continuous collision detection? And that is because I have to store a lot of data. All the contact points are data that I need to transfer from the GPU to the CPU. And this data look something like this. And then I want to do the contact resolution. And there are several basic approaches with different time complexities. And to find out which is the best, I conducted a user study where I abstracted from the hip reaming task. I basically abstracted 3 tasks from that: finding contact, rotation while in contact, and pushing while in contact. And all I compared with steel-on-steel contact, because that is basically the worst case for haptic rendering, because it's such a stiff material. And then I compared these 4 methods. So the user was tasked to do one of the 3 tasks. On the left you see the physical object, and on the right I rendered the haptic object, or I rendered the object haptically with one of the 4 methods. And the results, and then they rated how realistic is it. They compared left and right. And the results show that for contact, the impulse method is the most realistic. For rotation, constraint, and rigid body is the most realistic. And for pushing, only the penalty was rated as less realistic than the other ones. The other ones were comparable. So since we see that each method has its benefits, I adopted a hybrid approach for the contact resolution, taking ideas from several approaches. So first I construct a velocity constraint for each colliding contact, but I do not solve them with these slow global solvers. Instead, I use an iterative approach and I apply partial impulses with friction. Partial meaning that I have this extra factor besides the standard equation for the impulse. And after each iteration, I check if all constraints happen to be met. And why friction is important, I will tell you later. And for resting contacts, I do not use the impulse method. Instead, I use the penalty method. I just found that for haptic rendering, it feels more fluid on the surface if you use penalty forces instead of impulses. And so the method here is, or the equation is pretty standard, except for that my penetration measure is volumetric instead of translational. So here you can see some result. I can move across the surface fluently, and in red you see the contact normals. And yeah, any part of the tool can interact, and I can lodge the hip reamer behind the hip, and I can also have multiple contacts. All right, so now we move on to material removal. But first I do so-called, or what I call surface estimation, where I linearize the contact set, because I need some of the contact data during material removal. And my goal for that was to modulate the tool feed rate, so how fast does the tool move through material as it's taking it off, based on how much pressure does the user apply. So if I push harder, it should take off material faster to some extent. And the cutting area should have an inverse effect. So if the hip reamer is surrounded by a lot of material, it should more slowly feed through the material as it's taking it off. Similarly, the local material density should have an effect. So for example, if you drill through enamel, which is harder than dentine, it should be slower. Yes. And the cutting model that I ended up with works as follows. I define a reference feed rate and a maximum, and then I modulate based on the local pressure. So here I have the local body position lever and use that to localize the pressure. And I also modulate by global contact volume, scaled with the density. So since I scale the contact volume here by density, I basically satisfy point 1 and 2, point 2 and 3. And you might ask, why do I use the global contact volume? That is really difficult to explain. So out of time's sake, I will just say that it is physically not plausible to use the local contact volume.
May I ask what is global and local in this case?
Global is basically a summation of the contact set. So let's say I have let's say I draw this from the top. This is the hip reamer. Let's say I have like these two contacts. Then local would mean, you know, I could take off more material here than here, whereas global means the sum, or you know, a weighted average of these has an effect.
On both.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So, sorry. So the hip reamer, I also separate the sphere packing for the tools into two parts. Here, this free part is called passive because it cannot take off material, and an active part which can take off material. And additionally, I compute such a direction for each of these active spheres. And those decide in which direction can it take off material primarily. For the reamer, it is not as important as for the bone saw, because here you can see, okay, the teeth of the saw are pointing forward, so you can only take off really material forwards. You cannot take off material when you push down, for example. So all these normals point forwards, all these directions. And at runtime, I use these to modulate again per contact or locally the angle, based on the angle between the contact normal and the drill direction. And the result you can see here. So if I try to take off material laterally, I cannot, even if I push down. But in the normal direction, I can take off material with ease. Okay, so now we have modulated this actually a radius extension, and this radius extension, in practice, it is really small. It is around 10 micrometers, and this gives some amount of overlap, but this overlap could be arbitrarily small. There are no steps or no grid that discretizes this. And an overlap then leads to this directional shrinking of a sphere. So the material removal is completely stepless. Now, what about the friction that I mentioned earlier? Here I have a video of a surgeon using the hip reamer, and you can see that the hand is somewhat shaking. And that is something a surgeon has explained to me always happens during hip reaming, that you get these angular impulses or shakes. And if you finish or close to finish reaming, then the torque increases instead. And I thought this could be well explained by what I call drilling friction. So basically, I assume that the hip reamer head is moving at a certain rotational speed. Of course, I don't simulate it, but I assume it during the tangential impulse solve. So the point velocity that would normally be rather slow, I increase by the rotational speed. And what I get then is the following behavior. So on the left, I try to keep the tool as steady as possible, but you see that there are these shakes. And on the right, I have plotted the torque in body frame. And so here you can see on the x-axis, you get these oscillations, which pretty well mimic these shakes. And at the end, we get an increase in torque. And then I also stop reaming. And you can see that this shape is well matched by what I've carved out. So that's the goal of the hip reaming step. And so I thought this is really cool that I get this emergent, physically plausible effect when I change relatively little about the simulation. Okay, now we've only talked about haptics. I also want to talk about audio feedback, because that is also important for the immersion. So especially in dentistry, you have these characteristic sounds that are really uncomfortable to hear. And I wanted to recreate this in my simulator, and I created a frequency response modulation based first only on the motor rotation speed. So you see here that as the motor is turned on, we have this exponential increase in frequency. And when it's turned off, we have this exponential decrease in frequency. And so I fit exponential functions through that, which mimic this behavior. And I also modulate based on cutting resistance. Since I already have all of this data in my simulation, I can simply sum up all these overlaps during one frame, and that gives me a good estimation of the cutting resistance. And the result you can see here. Okay, so that's it for the physics. Now I will talk about visualization, because, well, we have done so much drilling that the sphere packing that we pre-computed might not match anymore to the triangle mesh. So we have to generate a new one. And that's the goal of the visualization, to basically do the reverse. From sphere packing, generate a triangle mesh. But at interactive rates, and we want to have a good visual quality. It should look convincingly like a tooth, for example. And for that, I have designed this visualization pipeline that starts out with a signed distance field generation. So I evaluate the signed distance field on a voxel grid, but I use spatio-temporal coherence, and so I only consider where the tool is, the active part of the tool is moving, and in this bounding box I compute this signed distance field. And I update this bounding box too if I happen to see that values didn't really change. And this allows me to compute this very fast. Otherwise, it would be very slow to do this for each voxel. Next, I do a smoothing. So bilateral smoothing, that is an algorithm from 2D color images that takes into account not only the distance between pixels, but also the color values. And here I adopted this to the signed distance field. And so the color matches to the signed distance here. And the result you can see here. So you see that, for example, this highlight is really scattered on the left. But if I enable the smoothing, it's clearer. And also the shape of the fissures is clearer. And we have less of these bumps compared to here. But I also, so this is only smoothing for the signed distance field, but I also smooth normals and colors. And what this gives me is a much better result. Here you almost have no noise, and you can still see all of these fissures and small detail. Okay, so next we'll talk about marching cubes. Marching cubes, the goal here is to convert the signed distance field into a triangle mesh. And well, here again I had to optimize a lot and to only compute what I have to compute, what actually changed. And I also implemented this on the GPU in parallel to optimize it. And I extended the original algorithm by trilinear interpolation of these normals that you seen before, and also colors. And to optimize the data transfer, I use a multigrid approach to minimize the data that I need to send to the game engine. So here I only update the triangle list for each of these coarser grid cells. And then I also do a vertex pooling to reduce the data further. And then I can send these updates to the game engine, which minimize the data. And all of these optimizations allow me to reach these 10 Hertz. This maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but if you didn't optimize any of this, one frame would take 10 seconds or 5 to 10 seconds. Yes, so that's it for visualization. Now we go to haptics. So the goal of haptics is, of course, to generate a force for a haptic device. And here I base my approach on the well-known virtual coupling approach. So I have two instances of the tool. There's one instance that is actually simulated, so it's a simulated body that should not penetrate the environment, and we have a what I call haptic tool, which is directly attached to the haptic arm. So wherever the haptic arm is, the tool follows without regard for overlap. And between the two, there is a spring attached, and the spring decides what forces are moving this simulated object around, and it also decides, on the other end, what forces are rendered to the haptic device. And yeah, these are the standard formulas for force and torque, but I wanted to improve the haptic stability, so I added two damping terms. So next to the relative damping here, I added absolute damping terms for torque and force. This just increases the parameter space and allows me to tune the simulation more, so to increase either higher stiffness or better stability. And I have also found out that if you have such a setup where a virtual contact point might be very far away from the end effector, the setup is not really ideal. So it can help to have an additional damping term for the torque that is designed to stabilize this position, whereas the normal damping is of course designed to stabilize the center of mass. Another really important extension is force saturation. Here we have the problem that we want high stiffnesses so that the simulation feels crisp and we don't feel any unnatural inertia during movement in the air, for example. But on the other hand, we want low accelerations to have high stability. And so it might happen that you get, if these are not balanced, you might get such a integration candidate. And you can see here that this spring can be tensioned theoretically infinitely, but the springs that produce the force in the contact margin, they are limited. So to make up for this, so this is especially in my simulation a problem. So to make up for this, I introduce saturation, which can balance these forces out. So it basically just means that the force magnitude of this spring is limited. Of course, I also limited for this, but that would be a different case. So then our integration candidates happen or are more likely to be within the contact margin, which is good for us. Here you can see a result where I use haptic rendering for the hip reamer. So I can render arbitrary objects of arbitrary complexity and produce 6 degrees of freedom feedback. And any part of the tool can contact and it remains stable. Okay, so now I will talk about haptic registration because, as I mentioned earlier, it is really important for hand-eye coordination training that we have an alignment of where we feel things and where we see things. And so the next part is a bit more technical, but please bear with me because this is really important for the simulation function, the simulator function. And so my idea was to use the fact that if I mount a VR controller at a fixed relative pose to the haptic devices, such as this, then I can track the position of these haptic devices with the VR controller. And then using my method, so without my method you have this mismatch that basically where you feel the devices does not match where you see them. So the virtual tools are somewhere else, could be anywhere else, and there's a mismatch, and using my method I can compute a new position for the camera such that the relative position between virtual tools and virtual camera is the same as the relative position for the real tools to the real head, meaning where you feel the devices is also where you see the virtual tools. Okay, so looking back at our research questions, we have modified the physics and haptics to make the simulation ready for high force haptic feedback. And we have also introduced material removal that is completely stepless at haptic rates. And I also want to quickly mention that all of these tasks I have implemented on the GPU with parallelization because those are the ones that take the longest time, and I wanted to optimize the performance. So and next we will talk about research question 3, which concerns with the efficacy of these simulators. So for that I have developed 3 simulators. in research projects. The first one is called HIPS. And here we have, well, this was a funded research project with TU Chemnitz and several other partners. And we have simulated hip reaming with this KUKA robot. So this is only part of the hip surgery. But we, for that, we won the German VR award, German Institute for VR award in 2019. And later on, we extended the simulator in a follow-up research project called Dynamic Hips. And here we simulate the whole surgery. And for that, we also won the German Institute for VR award in 2023. So those are the guys from TU Chemnitz receiving them. Yeah, and the last simulator is the dental simulator. This was developed in cooperation with the Mahidol University. And yeah, this is a picture. So it's a bimanual simulator. And yeah, this was really popular. And we have conducted a few user studies with this with great success. And so first I want to talk about hips. So in the new hip simulator, we can render 2 of the surgery simulation steps using traditional haptic devices, but with large forces with all the methods that I showed you before. And there are also some steps in the surgery that involve hammering, and those cannot be rendered on these traditional devices. And TU Chemnitz has developed a new hardware for this, and this has a completely new rendering paradigm. And out of time's sake, I cannot really explain it in detail, but the overview is that TU Chemnitz have done these biomechanical experiments. They gathered a lot of data that they gave me, and I developed a material model that can represent this data, and I basically modulate the breaking force of the device depending on where the insertion depth is. That's the summation, and it then looks like this. So as the instrument is inserted, you can see here that it's moving forward. The breaking force is adjusted based on my material model. And we have shown this to a group of 18 surgeons. And here you can see some impressions. So they have done the whole procedure in the simulator. Yeah, and then we asked them for feedback, and they gave really positive feedback. But what I want to highlight, so all of these questions were positively phrased, and here the answers are mostly green. But what I want to highlight is that even though this was a prototype, they would still recommend that medical students of the last year and even residents practice on this state of the simulator, which I found was really incredible and really great outcome. And yeah, that was the conclusion of HIPS. And then we will talk about the dental simulator. So I think we've already seen some videos. This is bimanual. And we have used this first to investigate the effects of HMD VR. And here we have identified 2 main variables, the 3D rendering, because you can have stereo 3D in a HMD, and hand-to alignment, which is easy or doable with HMDs, but really difficult with monitor-based simulators. And so we have divided the participants in 4 groups, and we measured their performance with real-world metrics before training and after. So they basically had to drill this anatomically correct tooth, and it was rated by experts. We also measured the virtual performance. And here you can see one student doing the procedure. So here you can see also that it's on the lower jaw. Using the dental mirror was not really necessary to complete this, which we will change in a later study. And talking about the results, you can see here that hand tool alignment had a positive effect on the learning gain. Here, the alignment group improved more by real-world measures. So this is a really great outcome. For the stereo 3D, we did not see such a large effect in the learning gain. But what we saw instead is that the initial performance in the simulator was better. And also we saw that the skill transfer from pre-training into the simulator was more correlated. So we believe that stereo 3D is better for skill transfer from real to VR. And in the next user study, we wanted to focus on gaze. So can the gaze behavior of students tell us something about how good they're learning or how well they're doing? And for that, I implemented custom eye tracking integration. I mentioned this because the official Unreal plugin from the manufacturer was slower and less accurate than my implementation. And I also implemented a custom VR zoom feature. This is basically trying to simulate the surgical loops that dentists like to use. And yeah, I mentioned this because it took a lot of modifying of the Unreal Engine, which is a huge chunk of source code. And here we focus on the upper jaw. This was by design, so that we forced them to use the dental mirror. Since this makes the gaze behavior even more interesting, since you use the reflection of the mirror. So here in blue, you can see my gaze ray. And we tracked all of this during the user study, and then I evaluated the data. And I found, so firstly, I found that the learning effect was really high this time. So after they had a much, much lower error score, but this was not really because the post score was better, it was actually because the pre-score was much worse. So I believe a good explanation for this is that doing this procedure without any training in a mirror is almost impossible or really difficult. And that's why they improved so much. And what also is a positive outcome is that we saw that the virtual learning gain and the real learning gain were highly correlated, meaning people that improved a lot inside of the simulator also improved in the real world measures. And due to a lot of reasons, I could take a bit of time to explain. I could not use existing gaze-based metrics. So I formulated new ones, and one of the most important one, I think, is the consistency of vision. And this I quantified in vision breaks, which are periods of time where they could not see the tooth for around 1 second. So during the procedure, they maybe have a wrong position for the mirror, and they could not see the tooth for 1 second, then this was counted. And as you can see here, students did improve in this, so they lowered these vision breaks, but experts were much better than the students, and even at the last trial, they were not on par with experts, which was not the case for a lot of other metrics. So students would be on expert level after the 6th trial. What we also saw is that this new metric correlates well with simulator performance. and also with real-world learning gains. So people that had more of these breaks tended to do worse. Okay, so in conclusion, I have shown you, I've presented to you my intersection-free simulation that has a modular collision response, and I have shown you a material removal that is completely stepless at haptic rates. And I've combined both of them into a novel simulation system with which I can render rigid 6 degree of freedom tools. I've also shown you the first high-force surgical VR simulator that has a lot of nice features, including automated registration of VR and haptics. And I have objectively proven the dental simulator's learning efficacy. And for the other simulators, I could show you wide approval by surgeons regarding the usefulness and realism of the simulator. For future work, I would be interested to know how the feedback, if I provide it in real time, would affect the learning process. For example, if I show the some gaze metric during the procedure, would it help during learning or would it even distract them? And on the simulation side, I would like to expand to deformation. So for example, flexible tools like during root canal, you have to file the root canal, and so the file has to take on the shape of the root canal, which would be interesting, and this could later then be expanded to support general soft tissue deformation and even cutting. And I would also be interested to know if more expensive collision responses, such as constraints with global solvers, do improve, or how do they compare with cheaper collision responses. And here you can see some publications where I'm the first author. So 7. Don't be confused here. The first 3 authors are here shared first authorship. And in these publications, I'm the co-author. Yeah, and with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome any questions.